What's going on, guys? RBG here, bringing you more coverage on Marvel Spider-Man 2, a game that has yet to be announced, but the writing is pretty much on the wall that it will be. Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales pulled out the bookmark from where the last chapter left off in Marvel Spider-Man 1, and it essentially serves as the middle point leading up to the official sequel to the first game. Although I had a blast playing Miles Morales, I couldn't help but notice that there was something missing that kept it from feeling as epic as its predecessor, and I'm going to give you my review along with some details on the second game, so stay tuned. Now, before we jump into today's video, I want to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, G2A. If you're looking for a way to purchase the hottest video games without burning a hole in your wallet, you should really consider checking them out. They offer key codes for different platforms such as Steam, PS Network, and Xbox for half the price of the original. So why wouldn't you want to take advantage of this deal? You absolutely lose if you overpay. So go ahead and seize the win. You can do so by clicking the link that will be provided in the description of this video. So yeah, guys, this has been an insanely crazy couple of weeks pertaining to the Spider-Man property. The third installment of the Marvel Studios Spider-Man is just over the horizon, and there's already been a media circus tornado in terms of the casting. We're getting former webhead actors Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield to reprise their roles, and there's the rumor that Miles Morales could possibly be making a cameo. Since the character has jumped from the comics into mediums such as the games and movies, he's proven that there's more than enough room for multiple Spider-Mans to share the limelight. And Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales shows that the main Spider-Man doesn't necessarily have to die in order for the next Spider-Man to fill in his shoes. When the game was first announced to generally positive audiences, there was a bit of a pushback and hostility from those who assumed that Peter would be axed, while people with common sense like myself knew that this couldn't be the case since there's likely a sequel being worked on as we speak. But due to the multiple instances of the character meeting his demise and other lore, some assumed that it was inevitable for our boy Petey to push up daisies. Even if the word death was never uttered in the title, anytime a Spider-Man Miles Morales video was posted, you could bet that there was going to be a comment outright shunning the game based off the assumption that Peter would die. But eventually more news started to surface along with evidence based on events from the previous game that ensured us that Peter will be sticking around for a while. He doesn't necessarily have to be killed off. He can just be taking a well-deserved break from crime fighting. And that's exactly what Insomniac's portrayal of the webhead is doing. Now, just a word of warning, if you haven't played or completed the game, you may want to click off this video because the commentary will contain spoilers. This channel has faced a bit of backlash from just covering what was being marketed by the officials, and I've done my best to give you guys a grace period just so I wouldn't spoil anything for you. And this game has been out for almost a month now, so if you haven't played it by now but chose to watch this video, then you're clearly not interested in picking up the product, and this video should have little effect on you. But if you just so happen to not have purchased the game because times are hard and you have to be a little tight with your money, then I implore you to click away now. You've been warned. But yeah, guys, even though Spider-Man Miles Morales was short, it was nothing short of amazing. Even though this game is an extension of the first game, it's still worthy of being on the front line of PS5 launch titles. You don't even have to own that specific console to see that. Like, I've seen so many cool looking screenshots and clips from the PlayStation 5 version, and it never ceases to amaze me how beautiful the game looks. And I'm thankful that Insomniac is giving us the option to simply use our PS4 copy via smart delivery once we make the leap to next gen. Nonetheless, Spider-Man Miles Morales looks exceptionally well on the PlayStation 4, which is now considered last gen. Of course, there are some glaring differences such as the game not featuring ray tracing and the hair textures look a little off compared to the PS5 models, but everything else was what you'd expect, especially if you played the first game. Since the City That Never Sleeps DLC, Miles has finally come into his own as Spider-Man, but even though he's mastered the basics, he still has a ways to go before he fully fills in the shoes of the main Spider-Man, and that particular concept brilliantly lends itself to the game's narrative. For the longest time, we've been thrown into the story full throttle with Peter Parker, who's always been confident in his abilities, and Insomniac, whom I'm sure was aware of this, threw us in with a Peter Parker who's been swinging around for almost a decade. So it was a breath of fresh air to play with a character that was the total opposite of Peter. You'd think Miles would play fairly similar to Peter, but somehow the devs made it to where it really feels like you're playing with a Spidey that's greener when it comes to his abilities. You probably heard me say in a video comparing the two character speeds how I think Miles is a tad bit slower, like he feels more floaty than Peter, which I think is a realistic approach because for one, he's a lot leaner than Pete and he swings as if he's trying to stay in the air as long as he can to pull off some more tricks. Like, he's literally, as the devs described him to be, an acrobatic skydiver, and it just feels good experimenting with him. The way Insomniac is able to incorporate things like his Venom blast to perform air dashes are creative, and then you have the way you utilize it to power up generators. Top of that on with the camouflage powers, which gives you a little splash of stealth. I said the only thing I wasn't too impressed with was his combat. Like, I'm not sure if it was just me, but the punching and kicking animations felt off, and when Miles performs his web zip, it looks like he wants to vault over the enemy's head, but he switches to something else. But I guess that just goes back to the whole idea of him being a less than stellar Spider-Man in certain areas. Speaking of less than stellar, although I thought the Spider app missions was a nice way to differentiate Miles' side missions from Peter's, I did notice that they were a little underwhelming at times. Like, I get the idea is to let Miles build a relationship with the citizens of Harlem, and there's somewhat of a payoff at the end of the story, but other than that, they didn't really keep me engaged or enthused to complete them unless it was mandatory to progress to the next level. And that was a bit of a surprise because I felt like the first game had a giant tapestry of interwoven plot lines that connect to the main story. Like, you always felt like each side mission contributed something bigger to the story, but unfortunately Miles Morales doesn't, which is disappointing because you'd expect the devs to give us more to make up for the already short length. But moving on to the more spoilery talk, I want to harp on the main story because this is where things get very interesting. I mentioned in a previous video that this is the most different version of Miles we've seen from any other incarnation, because unlike the other versions who were for the most part reluctant to don the Spider-Man mask, this version is ready to show the world what he's got, and this attitude somewhat hinders him because he messes up a lot in this story. More times than not, he's contributing to the huge damage bills caused by the villains, but we gradually see him learn from his mistakes. As soon as Peter goes on his vacation to Simcaria for a few weeks, you have to take on the mantle. Something I love is how aware the citizens are that you aren't the Spider-Man that's been swinging around for the past 9 years. You're the quote-unquote other Spider-Man.
Hey, right here.
What? Not you, my cat. Named after the real Spider-Man.
Can the other Spider-Man do this?
But as I mentioned earlier, by the end of the game, the citizens you help in these side missions refer to you as their Spider-Man or Harlem Spider-Man.
Who is he?
That guy? He's our Spider-Man.
We finally got the big reveal we were eagerly waiting for, that being the Tinker's true identity, which is Miles' childhood friend Finn. I know there were some heavy hints that made it seem like it was going to be Yuri Watanabe, but I kinda had a feeling that it was going to be swerving us, because as we all know, Spider-Man's rogues gallery are more times than not the people closest to him in his personal life. If you're familiar with the comics, you know that the Tinker's true name was Phineas Mason, but the story writers for this game totally swapped his gender and turned him into Finn Mason, and I think it was for all intents and purposes to give Miles a fresh new villain while adding something cool to the Tinkerer character, because Miles doesn't necessarily have a huge list of villains to fight like Peter does, not to mention that the only thing Earth 616 Tinkerer can do is create advanced tech, but this version of the character was given the Tinkerer name by her late brother Rick Mason, who died from an overexposure to new form, and in order to exact her revenge on Roxxon, she joins the Underground gang and creates their new weapon, Programmable Matter. I like the concept of all of this, but I feel like the execution was a little sloppy. For one, the story reveals her identity way too early, which makes the build-up non-existent, and even though she invented the Programmable Matter tech, they don't really show how she did it or how she rose up in the rankings to lead the Underground. Like, this game's story doesn't really have a lot going on in terms of captivating villains. You have a childhood friend who's trying to exact her revenge on the giant energy corporation that caused her brother's death. You have the witty mustache twirling executive of said energy corporation who doesn't necessarily contribute anything, like he's barely even there, and there's the Prowler, who I think Insomniac should have never revealed in any other promotions, and you have a refurbished villain in the form of the Rhino. Like, all these were cool, but they could have been executed a little better, because you can see certain plot elements coming a mile away. Even though this version of the Prowler helps you throughout the game, you know there's ultimately going to be a fight between him and Miles, and you know there's going to be a big battle between Miles and Finn, so there's that. I think the biggest surprise is that Miles' mom Rio now knows that he's Spider-Man, so it's going to be interesting seeing how he juggles his personal life with his superhero one. But it looks like Miles isn't necessarily going to have a problem micromanaging both aspects, especially since his mentor Peter is back around. But moving on, we gotta talk about the post-credit stinger. I know there were some of you guys who were a little disappointed since it basically is a continuation of what happened in the first game's post-credit scene. If you remember, we saw Norman Osborn looking at his son Harry in a green tank with what looked to be the symbiote. Since Harry was suffering from a rare genetic disease, Norman decided to place him in a stasis to slow down the progression until he could find a cure. And that cure will most likely be the symbiote, because we see the substance reach out to Norman when he places his hand on the container. What I find interesting about this is how the game's story seems to be borrowing the same concept for the Amazing Spider-Man 2's Harry Osborn, who also was suffering from a rare genetic disease. And considering that this story is alluded to him potentially becoming Venom, it will more than likely take a couple of notes from the Ultimate Spider-Man animated TV show, because Harry is the more prominent host for the symbiote in that particular incarnation. Anyways, fast forward a year later and we see things from Harry's point of view as he regains consciousness. Norman notices this and tells the doctor to open the container, despite his warnings that it could be too risky to let Harry out so soon. Based on the missing arm and the Kurt name dropped by Norman, we know that this doctor helping him with the cure is none other than Kurt Connors, aka the Lizard. And it's pretty much been confirmed that he's already become the Lizard in this universe, since it was mentioned during Peter's recollection of it when you find Dr. Connors' blood sample from one of his backpack collections. He assumed that the Lizard was still out there since he says that Connors came out with a cure, but the cure didn't work. But it looks like Connors was able to somehow get rid of the Lizard, or at least control it. I think it's safe to assume that the Lizard will make its own screen appearance as a boss in Marvel Spider-Man 2. Like, I don't think the story writers would just show Connors of all people in the post-credit stinger if this wasn't the case. I also expect there to be at least two versions of Venom, the classic black Venom and the white one, also known as anti-Venom. Because as I mentioned earlier, this version of the symbiote may borrow from the Ultimate Spider-Man animated series, where we see Harry pose as the new Spider-Man after getting the black suit.
So what are you?
I'll tell you what I am. I'm better than you.
We could possibly see the suit feed off his anger and become the massive hulking Venom like it did when Harry became angry after Norman blew him off. And later he could become anti-Venom, since that particular symbiote is known to cure anything, which I think would be dope because anti-Venom really hasn't been featured in any major Spidey games since Spider-Man Edge of Time. I'm just not quite sure how they're gonna go about introducing him. Like in the original comic storyline, anti-Venom was introduced after Eddie Brock, who was dying from cancer, interacting with Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative. We know that this version of Mr. Negative was created after Norman tested the Devil's Breath on Martin Lee, giving him ultraviolet powers. If you remember, it was originally supposed to be a cure for Norman's wife, who had the same genetic disease as Harry, but it ultimately became a bioweapon that killed many New York citizens, including Aunt May. Thankfully, Morgan Michaels, one of the doctors responsible for creating the Devil's Breath, was able to create an anti-serum. So I wouldn't be surprised if that same anti-serum resurfaces and counteracts the symbiote in Harry's blood to create anti-Venom. But with that, I'm gonna end this video. I know I was a little all over the place, but I hope you guys enjoyed this review / breakdown. And I know it took me forever to get it out to you guys, but better late than never, right? Anyways, let me know what you think about it. Do you think that Harry will become both the black and white Venom? And do you think we could see the Lizard? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, I ask you to like or dislike the video. It doesn't have to be a thumbs up, it can be a thumbs down. Any feedback is good feedback and will only help me improve on my channel. But if you really enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you shared it with all your friends and followers on different social media outlets. Sharing really makes a difference. But once again, this is your boy RBG signing out on another video. I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.